This is a little bit of a clickbait. It's an exaggeration when I say why Darwin is wrong. Technically, I will show you there is something wrong with what Darwin says, but Darwin isn't really wrong in that sense. His insight is quite frightening. So it's a bit of an exaggeration, but I think I can show you that there is a point I'm making, that there is something wrong with what the expert, old Darwinists obviously after Darwin, believe is happening where evolution is concerned. He's technically wrong because by definition, therefore the establishment is wrong about natural selection, in that they believe it to be morally neutral, because they're afraid of the bloodbath, as you'll see in a minute, of all these parasites and predators ripping each other apart. How can there be any moral code in this system? And so they sort of try to sidetrack it and say that it's morally neutral, implying that the human models have come from somewhere else, and the only place they could have come from, of course, is God. So if you don't believe that it's part of evolution, then you must be a creationist. And of course that is a major contradiction within Darwinists themselves. What is nature? I think this is important that we try to define exactly what we mean by nature. When Darwin talks about evolution, he is talking about the complexation of DNA only. He had no idea about the earlier path, because, as I've tried to explain, physics and especially quantum physics, our knowledge of atoms and so on, has come a long way, and in his time he didn't have that. So it's understandable, but in the previous videos I have tried to show you that there are two paths. The alienated gravity, which is basically life, which starts off with hydrogen and forms the atomic Serengeti, or atomic speciation, and compound speciation, and so on. So since we only have just two paths in the universe, if we discount DNA and its evolution, or i.e. the path of alienation, we are left with a single event, and that's gravity. So if we forget about DNA and what DNA does to itself, in other words, the selective pressure that it places on itself, then we basically are talking about gravity. So nature, in this context, pure nature, is pure gravity. So nature, therefore, is gravity. Why? And what is the motive of nature? Gravity hates alienated gravity, because this is a mistake. It should have never happened. That's not what gravity was trying to do. It was just trying to squash things together. It wasn't trying to make new things, where fusion occurs and we get new entities. So gravity hates life, and it strives to kill it. It never stops. It's relentless, and you'll see why we have this problem, in evolution. Therefore, complexation cannot occur from nature. If something is trying to kill you all the time, then you cannot get complexity or complexation from it. It's not helping you. For example, if you're trying to build a house with bricks and mortar and the wind keeps blowing it off, you cannot be expecting the wind to help you in some way. So therefore nature, in this context, pure gravity, is entirely destructive to DNA. By the way, the reason why I keep talking about DNA instead of life is that we really only have a single life form that we know of, and that is DNA, and RNA being part of it, of course, whether it was at the beginning or now some viruses, etc. But they're all part of the same basic code and genes. This is the only life form we know of. There are no plethora of life forms. For example, when you look in the Serengeti and you see all these animals, that's just you making the distinction. In reality, they're just different fragments of DNA all over the place. So a visual explanation, so you see what I mean when I say that gravity hates life, or alienated gravity, because this is what life is. Life is like a house of cards, a delicate thing that's held together by a scaffold of energy. And look at where it lies. If this is pure gravity and it's lying on the floor here, look how high that is, and therefore the energy gradient is huge, and gravity hates this and is trying always to normalize all the events, and therefore it can't wait to make it collapse, and it can't wait to organize all of its atoms and molecules in this fashion. So if we're talking about nature only, what are events in nature that exert selective pressure on DNA or life? Well, there are things like earthquakes, tsunamis, we have volcanic eruptions, we have meteorite collisions, droughts, radiation, flooding, forest fires, hurricanes, all of these, if you look at them, are entirely caused by gravity and gravity alone. So every single one of those is ultimately destructive to DNA. In fact, you might think, well, the sun is the source of energy and it's wonderful and it's helping us, but that's only because DNA has managed a way of harnessing that. But it's not really there to help us, because eventually this thing will kill us, and it will kill everything on planet Earth. So it's not there to help us when it goes into a red giant or whatever the hell it's going to do. So the establishment has contradictions, and in an argument, a contradiction is a clear example that something is wrong. The best example of this, as I've already mentioned, is that the establishment, Darwinian experts, believe evolution is morally neutral. They tried to make up, kind of gloss over it to try and see, get people to accept evolution, and at the same time say that, well, it has nothing to do with a moral code. We must come up with a moral code all by ourselves. And the answer here is that they fear the bloodbath of evolution, because obviously, just look around you. If you're watching any of David Attenborough's programs, you see nothing but animals tearing each other to pieces, and there's pain, there is suffering, there's a complete bloodbath. So how can there be a moral code within all of this? And they fear Nietzsche, a true and impossible moral philosopher. We will have to discuss this later when we actually come to discuss in detail the moral code of evolution, because it is impossible to have any kind of moral understanding or come up with an ethical code without truly understanding this guy here, because he is impossible to argue with. I know lots of people think they argue with him with coming up with some woke crap, and some belly-aching, yellow-bellied nonsense about, well, we're humans, we should know better, we should do this, when in fact they're not really thinking at all, because we're all psychopaths. If you believe you're not, I'm afraid you're in serious denial. You'll have to see who you truly are in order to understand what the moral code is. But in any case, just bear this in mind. And what they do, as I said, the establishment fears Nietzsche because he is fierce in his observation, and is frightening how he can see the true essence of this universe and evolution itself and complexation. So if we don't come up with a universal moral code that is beyond a reasonable doubt, then we eventually end up broken down and fall into relativism, meaning that eventually then whatever anybody says must be right, because why should one person be right and another one be wrong if we cannot justify it in a concrete sense of the word, almost like a mathematical equation? If we cannot justify something beyond a reasonable doubt that is universal, that applies to everybody, then it must be relativist, which is where we are now, this wishy-washy crap about woke culture, where everybody apparently has the right to be right. And that's insane. Anyway, here's the question that you should ponder for a minute. If the system is doubly negative, meaning if nature itself is a killer for DNA or life, and DNA itself is full of this destructive bloodbath, is trying to kill itself all the time, then why is DNA so successful? That's a very important question. How can it be so successful if it suffers from a doubly negative process, which is the only two processes that exist? If both of them are negative, how the hell can it be so successful? Successful. Is it effective and successful? Well, let's look at the evidence. If you weighed the first strand of RNA or DNA, look at the last universal common ancestor, which all biologists and natural historians would agree we all share the same one. So if we actually weighed that thing that was our very first great-great-grandmother, or whatever you want to call it, what would it weigh if we put it in here? Well, micrograms, smaller than micrograms. I don't know what the hell the smallest bit of gram is, but it would be tiny. Now look at it now. If you were to put all of the DNA fragments in terms of their weight and you weighed them, how much would they be? You see where the whole thing is going. The entire planet is actually transforming into DNA. It's changing it. It's using the materials that are there for DNA to take over. It's almost like an infection that keeps growing and growing. So it is successful. You can see it's successful despite the fact that over the millions of years, gravity has done everything it can to wipe it out. It's still successful. Think about all the volcanic eruptions, all the meteor collisions that have tried to wipe out DNA. It's still successful. So how can it be successful if it's doubly negative? So where does complexation come from then, if it is doubly destructive? It comes from DNA tragedy. Please remember this word, because this is important. In the normal establishment, they have no idea. They put him in, as Darwin calls gravity and DNA tragedy, both natural selection. That's not correct, because the establishment puts both of these processes in the same bag and calls it natural selection, and that's not correct, because you have to separate nature, true nature, away from DNA, and what DNA does to itself is a separate process, and that I call DNA tragedy for a good reason. You'll see in a minute. But this is where true complexation comes from. Nature kills it. The true complexation for DNA comes from DNA tragedy. So natural selection, here's a statement that I believe I can justify. Natural selection is entirely destructive. In other words, all the events that put selective pressure on DNA that come from gravity are entirely destructive. They just want to wipe it out. DNA tragedy is entirely complexing, and that's where the complexity comes from. It's entirely complexing. So let's see what that means. The best way that I can try and explain to you what that means is to use the example of the blind watchmaker. This is an argument used by people who think they understand evolution to argue against it. These are normally people who, by the way, think that one of the big problems about evolution is that almost everybody thinks they understand it. Although it's simple and elegant, but it does require quite a lot of homework before you start going around opening your mouth and bubbling on about it. But most people don't. They've just got a very simple, straightforward idea that monkeys decided to become humans. It's some vague idea, and then they just basically try to come up with armchair nonsense against it. And this has nothing to do with searching for the truth. It's intellectual jousting where my truth tries to beat your truth. It means really nothing. So unfortunately for them, this whole concept of the blind watchmaker, which by the way says that if you went into the jungle and you found a watch lying there, you wouldn't think that it had assembled itself. You would think that there was a designer and somebody who assembled that watch, because it's a very complex mechanism full of many complex bits that must fit perfectly together in order for the thing to work. So therefore a human being or an animal is infinitely more complex than a watch, and therefore it too must have had a designer and a maker. Well, unfortunately, this example actually proves that there is no designer and there is no maker. In fact, if you just look at it, what I just showed you at the back here, of all of these animals that have ever existed and keep dying and disappearing, if this was a factory, you would fire the manager or the designer, because he's making a real mess of it. Everything that he makes is non-sellable, it's non-viable, it keeps dying. It's a conveyor belt of producing broken crap, so what's the point? Anyway, so how does it prove it? How does the example of the blind watchmaker prove that this is the case? So if we go here's you or me, a blind person, and if we decide to go into the business of making watches, why we would want to do that is perhaps because we are woke and we think we should be able to do anything we like. But anyway, that's a decision for her to make. What would we do? How would we do it? Now, look at the most rational example. Here we have loads of spare parts, which is different species, if you like, of DNA, or different fragments of DNA that is constantly trying to diversify, mutate, so make new parts all over the place. How would you do it? Well, the answer is you would bang it and see. That's the only way you can do it. You basically grab different parts and you try to see if they fit together. And this is where the concept of tragedy comes from, because if you go through the process, This is the only process available for DNA. It is blind. It can't do anything else. So what would it have to do? It keeps banging things away. It's extensive in waste. It's very, very wasteful because you constantly keep breaking parts that don't fit together, like this one here, like parasitosis, bacteria, viruses, sexual competition, and so on. All seem destructive as you're looking at them there, but it's the only mechanism by which DNA can bang things together to see if they can fit. It's very painful. It's time-consuming. It's dangerous. It's very tragic from our perspective because it's full of pain and suffering. So therefore, I call it DNA tragedy because it is a tragic event. But ultimately, the process is oh so effective because, like I said, it is the only process by which DNA is complexed and is more or less taking over the earth. So infections, predation, parasitosis, sexual selection, competition are all eunomic in essence. They may not be always eunomic, but as a process, that's the only process by which things complex. I introduced this word here now because I think it's a very, very important word. In my opinion, it is the most important philosophical word ever. And it goes all the way to Hellenic Greece from the time of Solon. I will discuss this in great detail later in a video. My entire work that consists of 4 books that I've detailed 2 of them here, cosmonomy and then bionomy, psychonomy and socionomy, revolves around showing you the concept of eunomia. It is not something that you can define, you have to see it. It means the good order of things or the right order of things. In other words, the sequence of natural algorithms, the logical path of natural algorithms. But just bear it in mind, you'll see it in more detail. So all of these events here that I described, predation, parasitosis, sexual, etc., they represent the blind search for symbiosis. That's the key thing, because DNA complexes through symbiosis. You make a watch through symbiosis of different parts. That's exactly how it works. But it's blind. That's the problem, because it can't do anything else. It is not a conscious being at the irresistible stages. We are the conscious parts of component of the DNA now, but before us everything else had to go through this blind process. The fact that we close our eyes and become even more blind than the blind DNA before us, that's a different matter. That's because we're greedy and capitalist and stupid, but that's a different matter altogether. So if we look at this particular picture here, I'm using a very extreme example to justify the point I just made, that predation and parasitosis are all in essence eunomic. How can this be eunomic? I mean, look at it. This bloody thing is going to rip it to pieces and it's going to eat it, and it's as a process it's got to be entirely gravitational. Surely you can see this is what gravity is. You know, the sun is trying to rip the Earth apart, and the black hole at the center of the galaxy is trying to swallow everything else. So in essence, you're absolutely right. The motive is still gravitational. There is only one motive that cannot change. Alienated gravity does not have a motive, because the electronic slope, this line needs electrons, and this, relative to it, is electron rich, and it's going to eat it and consume its electrons. So in that context, you're absolutely right. The motive here is gravitational, but the process of banging parts together is ultimately eunomic. So if you think I'm talking rubbish, that this cannot possibly in any way eunomic, then let me show you. The greatest symbioses in DNA's evolution are entirely predatory in motive. This is what phagocytosis is, where a cell, like let's say an amoeba or a white blood cell or something, takes a foreign body. In a way, let's just say that this is some kind of a bacteria and it needs food. So it goes around a food particle and it forms this little hole around it and swallows it inside as a whole unit, and then dissolves its walls and basically breaks it apart and consumes it. So it swallows it literally through the membrane into itself. Mitochondrial cells were formed, everybody agrees, entirely through this process, where one bacteria tried to eat the mitochondria as food, and before that particular event, probably many bacteria ate the mitochondria and had a great time. It was a good food, but one of them at some point got stuck and it didn't digest the bacteria. The bacteria went inside it and became its powerhouse, and the two evolved simultaneously, side by side, as a eunomic congregation. They are symbiotes. So eunomic congregation or symbiosis, same word. And the chloroplast in the cells for making photosynthetic cells also evolved through exactly the same process. So you can see that although the motive is still gravity, the motive is predation, but it is the only way that DNA can bang parts together, and out of which it hopes to come up with blind symbioses. Why? Another example of why this process is selective is the one-way valve. And this is also important later when we discuss why we fail to come up with any form of complexation in our humanity. But yet, look at our technology. It complexes and it has complexed and is doing okay, yet we are still chimps on a motorbike. Our motorbike's getting faster, but we are still the same idiots that the hunter-gatherers in Africa were. So one of the reasons why this process works, you've heard people say if you gave infinite number of monkeys infinite sheets of paper and they just banged away willy-nilly, they could write the works of William Shakespeare. Well, that's nonsense. It would never happen. Infinity does not exist, and they would still have to, one single monkey would still have to sit there and bang away. But if you're into intellectual masturbation, then knock yourself out. That's not really a concept that is worth entertaining and wasting real time with. But what if I told you that only a few thousand monkeys very quickly could write the works of Shakespeare, if they used the method that DNA uses through DNA tragedy and the one-way valves, which is what we've been discussing. So if you take, for example, a blank sheet of paper and give it to a few thousand monkeys and they start banging away, and you start the banging straight away, what are the chances that one or more of them would have either typed a W or a WI? Well, there's a fairly good chance, if you have a few thousand of these things. Now, you take WI as a better survival rate. In other words, when we're talking about mutation here, and then the next generation, the generation that is more suitable to the environment, and in this case, it's suitable to our process. We take that, we make copies of this one now, and then give it back to the monkeys, and they start banging away again. And then we stop it again. So now, what are the chances that, remember, they've started with this, that they would have come up with either another L here or another L or I? Well, again, fairly good, really, if you have a few of them. You see where I'm going with it. So if you keep making copies of the viable one and redistributing it for selection, and making more copies of it, if you like, and then selecting them because they suit the environment and the survival, the chances of complexation are very, very good. And that's how you get the blind watchmaker coming up with a perfectly good watch. But when I say perfectly good watch, you have to understand that that's just us being stupid. We're still very much part of evolution. There's nothing good about us. Our eyes are just barely adequate to do the job. Our brains are barely adequate to, in fact, less than adequate, because we're basically killing ourselves. So how can it be any good if we're wiping ourselves out? Anyway, the idea was for me to try and show you how this process could be effective, and why what we consider to be destructive is in fact the only way where complexation can occur. Anyway, if you need a more complete and systematic explanation of the points raised here and the other videos, please get this book. It's free of charge from Kindle ebook. It may help you look at it in a bit more detail. I don't want anything from you. It may help you with science, because there are lots of problems in science, and they become very territorial and elitist, and I think the establishment needs to be challenged. Otherwise, we're just going to be cultists, and we're just going to produce robots